So once again, hi everyone, my name is Sophie and I'm currently a sophomore or a second year at Columbia University, and I'm studying mathematics and East Asian studies. So today I'm going to talk about one of these subjects that sometimes is considered a little taboo, but it's whether the Ivy League's actually worth what people say it is, whether it's worth the investment, and whether the prestige is equal to or speaks to the actual quality of an education at an Ivy League. I'll first start, this might seem like kind of a basic question, but I think it's an important distinction because it speaks to the quality of Ivy League as well as the quality of other universities in the US. So the Ivy League, despite what a lot of people think, this term has become synonymous with prestige and academic rigor and selectivity. But the Ivy League actually started as an athletic conference. So being in the Ivy League means that we just play sports together. So at the end of the day, it kind of boils down to our athletic affiliation rather than our academic rigor and just the selectivity of the university. So I wanted to make this distinction because just because a school in the US isn't in the Ivy League, that means they're not part of our athletic conference. But that doesn't take away from the quality of other schools. For example, MIT, Caltech, Northwestern, these are all very prestigious, very selective schools that have academic rigor and rankings that sometimes exceed some of the Ivy League schools. And just because they're not associated with the term Ivy League, that doesn't diminish at all from their quality. So I just want to make sure that people remember that while they're applying. So don't restrict yourself to just the Ivy League because it sounds good, but consider all of your options. And a lot of public universities like University of Virginia, University of Michigan, they're public universities, they're not even private. They're some of the most renowned and acclaimed programs and selective universities in the US. And some of them have acceptance rates lower than some of the Ivy League. So this word is it carries a lot of weight, but I don't want you guys to have its reputation restrict you while you're applying to schools. Be open-minded regarding which schools you want to consider because every school is different and they each offer a lot. And an Ivy League education might not be suitable for you. Everything's personal, so it depends on which school is a good fit for you. Okay, so I just wanted to preface with that. And now get into what exactly are the implications of going to an Ivy League school, and more so along the lines of the tangible implications, because going to an Ivy League, like I mentioned before, there's a lot of notoriety and name recognition, which can definitely be beneficial in the future. Just because you say you go to an Ivy League, there's certain things that people assume after hearing that, even though they might not necessarily be true. But just to preface, I don't know if you guys know what the Ivy League schools are, but there are 8 of them. So, I mean, Penn, Columbia, Harvard, Dartmouth, Yale, Cornell, Brown, and Princeton. They were all, except for Cornell, established during the colonial period. So they're quite old, and they only became the Ivy League quite recently in 1954. So, I mean, in the 20th century, their reputations got tied together through this athletic conference. So before that, they were kind of individual entities, and now they're known together. And like I mentioned before, there's a lot of public universities and private colleges and universities that are just as good in academics and campus culture and endowment as the Ivy League, but just because they're not part of it, that doesn't really diminish from their quality. So like I mentioned before, MIT, Caltech, Stanford, UChicago, and some of the public universities that are also very selective and have really great academics, UMich, Virginia, University of Texas, Austin. So just once again, try to keep your options open. And there are also a lot of great public and small colleges, liberal arts colleges that I haven't listed here, but just remember that the US has a lot of different schools. So just try to remember that while applying. And once again, to reiterate this point, as you can see, this is US News Today. This is their rankings for 2020. And just because you're in the Ivy League doesn't mean it's the top 8. UChicago, Stanford, MIT, Duke. I mean, there are a lot of universities that rank higher than some of the Ivy League in certain places. So Ivy League notoriety doesn't necessarily translate tangibly into rankings, academic quality, etc. So just remember that. So now I'm kind of moving into what exactly are the implications of going to an Ivy League school in terms of, especially tangibly, what does that mean exactly? And is it worth it? Because I know the student price on Ivy League schools is quite a scary number. For example, Columbia's tuition for this year was almost $90,000 with room and board. And that's definitely quite steep, right? So one thing to consider, you guys probably all know, is notoriety, the academics, the network, student body, campus culture, and endowment. So these are kind of the elements that an Ivy League might differ slightly than other schools, like perhaps public universities or trade schools. So in these elements, there might be some disparity that could either be suitable for you or not necessarily. So I'll kind of go slightly deeper into that with this. So school's notoriety, in case you guys aren't familiar with this word, it's the name recognition or how well known it is. And this is surprisingly impactful in a lot of sense, because for employers, let's say they see that on your resume, you finished an Ivy League, you graduated from one. There's certain assumptions that the employer might make about you and your capability, which although may not necessarily be true, the Ivy League name really helps you in certain areas. It carries a certain reputation that will definitely be to your benefit in a lot of situations. So like I mentioned, there's heightened employment opportunities from going to an Ivy League typically. And this is documented, but there's typically an increased earning potential. And I'll show you some charts at the end. But that means that if you graduate with an Ivy League degree, the starting salary might be higher. With an average starting salary is generally a little bit higher than if you finish a public school or a private university. And one thing about notoriety, which I really want to emphasize, is that a lot of really recognized and well-known faculty and people choose to teach at these institutions. So an Ivy League school has a really established reputation from hundreds of years of being there and of being known for their academic rigor. So a lot of the faculty at Ivy League schools is comprised of Nobel laureates, people who have won the Pulitzer Prize, people who are in the field making groundbreaking research in the sciences and in mathematics, people who are published. A lot of times the academic materials that are using are actually published by someone who worked at Columbia, and a lot of other schools are using materials that are published by Ivy League institutions and their faculty. So that can be extremely useful in the sense that if you have a class and you're taking a class with a Nobel laureate or someone who's really recognized internationally or nationally in their field, if you develop a really good relationship with them and you are able to get a recommendation letter, that recommendation letter will carry a lot of weight. For example, if you get a recommendation letter from someone at Harvard who, was your English professor and you're applying to work at the New York Times, that recommendation, just because that person is well-known, published, might carry some more weight than, let's say, if you went to another school and the faculty isn't that renowned. And just that's the unfortunate reality about name recognition. It does carry weight in a lot of situations. For example, Columbia University has a notoriously difficult biology class, and this professor writes for the MCAT. Her class is notoriously difficult, and she's well known nationally. And when you apply to medical school, if you have her recommendation, it's a significant benefit to you as an applicant because other medical schools know the rigor of her class. And if you're able to get a recommendation from her, they know that it's a testament to your investment and dedication and knowledge of the material. So that's just something to consider about, how notoriety translates into the faculty at these schools and how that could translate into helping you with employment opportunities in the future. Another really important thing that I think you guys have probably heard of is you constantly hear the Ivy League network as kind of a set phrase. And that's because there's a really strong alumni network available to you. The people who attend these schools, because they're pretty selective, it becomes a quite intimate community, not just among the Ivy that you attend, but the Ivy League in general. And this strong alumni network that's present, you're able to tap into even as an undergrad. So you don't have to wait until you graduate to take advantage of the opportunities that the alumni present you with. As an undergrad, there's at most Ivy Leagues, if not all. At Columbia, I can speak to that in particular. We have like an Odyssey mentorship program. So you reach out to specific alumni based on your interests and the career paths that you want to take. And as an undergrad, these alumni can put you into contact with people that you want to be put in contact with. They can provide you with internship opportunities or job opportunities, even as early as a freshman. Like I mentioned, my roommate, she's going into the medical field, and her freshman year, she got into contact with a Columbia alum who went to a really great medical school, and now he has a really great residency at a top hospital in New York. And as early as a freshman, she had just become a Columbian. She was already getting advice from him and opportunities in terms of what kind of different paths there are to go to medical school. So this alumni network is actually really beneficial to you. And also, like I mentioned, there's a lot of job opportunities and internship opportunities that come from being an undergrad at one of these institutions. Another thing that I don't know if you guys have heard this term, but it's called a feeder school. Certain Ivies are known to be feeder schools for certain fields. For example, UPenn Wharton, they're a feeder school for a lot of top investment banking firms. So like Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan. Columbia is also a pretty big finance school. So we send a lot of people to Goldman Sachs or consulting and things like that, those kinds of industries. So that's something to consider when you're applying. And also that can be really beneficial to you when you arrive, because if you're a feeder school, that means that there's a lot of alumni working at those companies. And just because you guys, the mutual experience that you have is Columbia. And that's usually enough to put you guys into contact. And the alumni are typically very willing to help you out or to give you some sort of guidance. Now, another thing that's really important in terms of, or like what makes an Ivy League unique, not necessarily typically in a beneficial way, is the endowment. An endowment is kind of their budget annually. And the endowment for the Ivy League is significantly high. And that is to your benefit because they have a certain amount of money that they can spend per year. And it's typically a really large amount, like I mentioned. So that means that there's a lot of academic resources available to you. And the facilities are usually quite nice and they're well maintained. Or, for example, I'm speaking Columbia as an example a lot of the time just because I go there and it's easier for me to reference. But recently, our endowment's quite large, and Columbia invested into an entire new STEM campus in the north of Manhattan with phenomenal resources. It's a beautiful building, beautiful campus, and they're able to do that because they have such a large endowment. And one of the things that's more applicable to each student directly is because it's like such a large endowment, the Ivy League typically gives incredibly generous financial aid packages. I'll explain this more a little later. There'll be some tangible figures that you guys can kind of experience. But just as an example, my friend at Columbia, he went to the same high school as me, and he's paying less for Columbia than he would a local state school. So all of his tuition got covered at Columbia. He's only paying room and board. So the price dropped from $90,000 a year to $10,000. And that's a significant difference. And most people who applied for financial aid get something, and I'll show you those figures a little later. Another thing to consider is the student body and the campus culture. So because these schools are selective, that kind of narrows down the student body to a certain type of individual. And that individual is usually very intellectually and professionally motivated and ambitious. This proves to your benefit usually because if you surround yourself by individuals who are really motivated, they'll typically motivate you. And it's a really great environment because if you're in class, and this especially speaks to a lot of humanities classes, but if you're in a class, your peers are the ones who are pushing the discussion. And if your peers are engaged and involved and really invested into the coursework, that will translate into the discussion and the overall academic atmosphere in the class. and that will make your learning experience more valuable. So I really wouldn't underestimate what your peers mean to your college experience. And this is something that I found, honestly, this is why I think Columbia is worth the tuition, specifically this last point, the student body and the campus culture. But one thing that a lot of people talk about, which comes from the fact that a lot of the students are really motivated, and it's not like motivated students are exclusive to Ivy Leagues. Every college in the US has motivated students. But one thing that a lot of people mention that is kind of a turnoff about the Ivy League is the ensuing stress culture and competition that is a product of collecting so many really motivated and ambitious students together. So a lot of people say or mention that the Ivy League is kind of toxic in the sense that, kids are too competitive. They look at each other as enemies rather than friends. It becomes really stressful. It's not good for your mental health or your GPA. And personally, I've never had that experience. I don't know if you guys are familiar with kind of the stereotypes of each Ivy, but Columbia is known for being one of the more stressful, one of the more quote unquote toxic Ivies with a really bad stress culture. And personally, I've been there for 2 years at this point, and I've never felt that way. So your college experience is what you make of it. So if you go in prepared for that with that attitude, prepared or expecting that, then that will definitely certainly not help your overall college experience. And it's not like stress culture is exclusive to Ivy League universities. Every school could have a stress culture potentially. It's basically how you manage your own emotional or mental state. And one of the things about the fact that we have such a large endowment, a lot of resources, the Columbia's, or not just Columbia, but all the Ivy Leagues and a lot of top universities in the US have a lot of mental health resources available to you. So in the case that, because academics truly are rigorous at these institutions that are more selective, but there are definitely outlets and mental health avenues to take that can help you, and people and resources that you can turn to if things do become stressful or difficult for you academically. And just to speak to that, I found one of the recent alum of Cornell had said this, and I just thought it would be kind of a good personal insight into just life in the Ivy League and some concerns that a lot of people might have before going. So, this person says that some days I doubted my decision to come to this school, and I feel like that happens to a lot of people regardless of where they go. There could be days when it's just rough. Perhaps you didn't do well on an exam or something. You might question yourself being there. I thought it ruined my mental health. That addresses one of the concerns about stress culture. Another thing is that a lot of people are concerned about GPA because typically an academically rigorous school, people might be worried that their GPA might not be as good compared to if they go to a less selective school and they're the top student there, especially if you're considering graduate study or a pre-professional path like pre-med or pre-law, because in that sense, your GPA is quite important. So a lot of people think that going to an Ivy League is sacrificing a lot of aspects of your life, like perhaps mental health and GPA. And this person said, I thought I was sacrificing a lot for Cornell experience. And indeed, he said that, yes, sacrificed a lot, but it was entirely worth it. And this statement is something that I completely agree with from my personal experience. And it's mainly because I had mentioned before that for me, it was worth it precisely because of this last box, the student body and the campus culture. And this person seems to agree because they say that the connections I've made are ones that I can't imagine finding anywhere else. And that's not only connections through alumni and, job opportunities, but it's also just the peers that you have and the student body that you're surrounded with. So I really can't emphasize this enough. The students you're surrounded with and the people you're surrounded with make your college experience. Especially this translates into the academic setting, not just extracurriculars, because the Ivy League in general, with such a motivated student body that is intellectually curious, and this is a general statement, there are definitely people who aren't that motivated, and very motivated people at other universities. It's just a general statement. But because people share such different interests, and because we have such a large endowment with a lot of academic resources, In addition to an affluent academic culture, there's typically a lot of extracurriculars that Ivy Leagues offer and a lot of opportunities that aren't academically based. For example, a lot of scholarships or grants to go study abroad or travel abroad, or different grants to start clubs and things like that. So it really makes the overall campus culture really rich because a lot of people are very intellectually motivated and curious and want to take part in different activities outside of academics as well. And one of the main questions though is all these things that I listed that are pro Ivy League more or less, is it worth it? Because with a sticker price of $90,000, people might question completely reasonably whether or not it's even worth paying that kind of money for the perhaps trivial or minuscule benefits of going to an Ivy League. And this graph shows that typically an Ivy League graduate has a higher median annual income after graduating, so all schools versus the Ivy League. But another thing that I want you guys to consider is that even though the earnings after are higher for Ivy League grads, the return on investment isn't necessarily higher. So even though you graduated from a private school and have a higher initial income because of that, and these are just averages, every person's different. So, but the price of it doesn't necessarily, your increased salary after doesn't necessarily compensate for the initial amount that you paid out. So the return on investment, which is an important figure, is 2 times higher for public school graduates versus private school. So in the end, financially, sometimes a public school might have a higher payout and be a better investment than an Ivy League education, purely fiscally. And you can see that for a student loan payoff also, state school graduates versus private schools. So if you went to a private school, your student loan payoff or your student loan debt will linger for about 4 years longer. So that's just something to consider, but all of these numbers, they get confusing and they're all pretty subjective and relative. It's all specific to your certain circumstances, and it kind of depends on you as an individual. If you're a highly motivated individual and you have a public school degree, if you're really motivated and talented, just because you have a public school degree, that doesn't mean you'll be making less money. And a lot of times you'll be making more because you're so motivated versus someone who did graduate from an Ivy League, but they just remained idle after graduation. Your degree matters and can be beneficial in terms of just name recognition for getting employment initially. But it's not like there's a salary cap or a certain potential after that is higher or lower depending on the school you went to. And this is another thing that I want to mention that could be a little misleading. These numbers are all slightly misleading in the sense that it says here that the return on investment is higher and that the student loan payoff is longer. So this implies, well, all these graphs imply that going to an Ivy League is infinitely more expensive than attending a public school. But that's not necessarily true. And I'll show you, this is Princeton's financial aid information from the class of 2023. So the ones who just finished their freshman year. And these numbers are all available on each site. If you go to the Ivy League sites, they'll have a class profile, which will give you just some general figures of that year's financial aid. So as you can see, approximately 61% of undergrads receive financial aid. That's a pretty large amount. That's, more than half. So I'd say that's quite significant. And 82% of recent seniors graduated debt-free. So if you graduate 82%, that's a large majority of the class. So if you graduated debt-free, the student loan payoff is no longer relevant because you have no loans to pay off. And also, so as you can see here, that large endowment gives you financial aid benefits in the sense that it makes the Ivy League education much more affordable. And as you can see here, the average grant was $56,000 about, and that's basically the price of tuition. And most Ivy Leagues are pretty comparable in these figures in the sense that, because they all have relatively similar endowments, they are able to give so much financial aid. So I wouldn't let the financial aid aspect or the cost of the Ivy League deter you from applying, because even if you apply and let's say your financial aid package isn't what you wanted, then you can choose not to go. But I think a lot of people don't realize that the Ivy League can be incredibly affordable depending on your financial or your family's financial situation. I mean, I gave that example earlier of how my friend is paying less than he would for a public school or a state school. So to him, that was great. And a lot of my friends are in that situation where they ended up paying less for an Ivy League education than they would for a public school education. So this large endowment is really beneficial in that sense. But one of the things also to consider is an Ivy League education worth it for every degree? And by this, I mean degree in terms of like STEM versus humanities subjects. Like, is an Ivy League worth it if you're going to get a physics degree versus if you're going to an Ivy League to get a philosophy degree? So the Wall Street Journal did an article about this precisely, and they did some research. And this is a quote from that article, but diplomas from prestigious schools boost future earnings only in certain fields, while in other fields, they simply don't make a difference. And what they mean by certain fields is typically they're referring to humanities subjects, while in other fields, they're typically referring to STEM. If you get an engineering degree at a state school versus an engineering degree at an Ivy League, your education is pretty much the same because curriculum for STEM subjects is standardized across all universities. For example, calculus, if you take calculus at University of Buffalo versus calculus at Columbia, you're going to be paying a lot more at Columbia, but you're learning the same material. So getting a name, I mean, it will help to a certain degree, that name recognition, but at the end of the day, a graduate from a state school in a STEM subject versus a graduate from an Ivy League will have the same set of skills. So for example, my brother, he goes to University of Buffalo, which is a New York State school. I'm also a math major, and he's an engineering major, he's aerospace. And our homeworks are the same, we use the same textbooks, we have the same assignments. So in that sense, there's a standard across STEM, so there's no disparity in terms of the actual material that you're learning. Whereas in humanities subjects, humanities fields aren't standardized. So the value of a humanities education significantly differs based on the faculty and your peers. So if you're taught by the most acclaimed people in their field, the pioneers in their field, versus someone who isn't that experienced or maybe not have that much name recognition, an employer might look at that differently because they know that perhaps what you learned in that class might be more valuable. I hate to say it like that because it's not like getting a humanities degree at a state school is any worse, but because of the selectivity of an Ivy League, I'll be quite candid. If you're surrounded by peers who want to be there and who are just as interested or more interested in the subject than you are, they will really add value to the discussion and they'll add value to your degree. So at the end of the day, a degree in the humanities, I think, is really amplified in actual value by the people you're surrounded with and by who the faculty is and who's teaching you. That's why if you graduate with a philosophy degree from, Harvard versus from a state school, they say that the earning potential for the Ivy League degree might be higher. So that's why he's saying that diplomas from prestigious schools boost future earnings in those certain fields. So that's just something to consider. Because quite honestly, if I was just going for math, I don't think Columbia necessarily would have been worth it for my personal situation. Because I'll be quite honest with you, my STEM classes at Columbia aren't that engaging because, well, it is what you make of it, but the curriculum's standardized. So, and in a lot of STEM classes, you don't get to know your classmates. The classmates aren't involved in discussion because it's a lecture, so you're just listening to the professor. In that sense, if I went to a state school, my mathematics education would be quite similar. Although, research opportunities might not be the same, just because at an Ivy League, there might be some really top labs that are doing pioneering research. So if you get an opportunity at one of those, that will definitely be beneficial to you, as well as the network. you could work or mentor underneath a really renowned professor. But in terms of just isolating the class and the value the class has towards your education, I think these schools are really worth it for the humanities. The discussions I've had in my humanities classes at Columbia are invaluable. So that's just something to consider as well. One person who, my peer and colleague, Andrew, he does some of the other presentations. I think he would be a great person to talk to about this, particularly because he transferred from a state school to Columbia. So I'm speaking without a basis of comparison because I've never been to any other school besides Columbia. But Andrew has a direct comparison, or is able to compare going to a different school, a state school, so a public school versus going to an Ivy League school. I don't want to speak for him, but we've talked about this several times because I've asked him whether or not he thinks it was worth transferring. And he said that Columbia is worth it for the students and the student body. And he's a CS major, so he's in STEM, but he thinks that it's worth it just for the people that you surround yourself with at these schools. But one thing also to remember, it's not like only Ivy Leagues have these kinds of students. Other schools do. And those 8 schools in the Ivy League, they aren't the only academically rigorous schools out there. Like I said, MIT's ranked higher than a lot of the Ivies. Caltech's ranked higher, UChicago. So that's just something to consider. Don't restrict yourself to the Ivy League, and don't discount public schools as well. Like I mentioned earlier, UMich, UVA, they're also incredibly selective, really great schools. But also, another thing to remember, even though they're public schools, they're also really selective. And at the end of the day, all of these schools are reach schools. So when you apply, try to be realistic and know that you could have a perfect GPA, perfect SAT scores, great essay, that doesn't guarantee you a spot. These schools are it's kind of a lottery system in the sense that it's really hard to tell who will get in, and there isn't really a formula to get in. So try to keep your options open, consider some safe schools and some just target schools, and make sure to really diversify your portfolio of which schools you want to apply to. So yeah, that's basically it, because unfortunately when talking about the Ivy League, a lot of this is subjective, at least coming from me, because I've had a really great experience so far. The only tangible things you can really evaluate about the Ivy League are, some of the perks of having really large endowment and network, but those things aren't exclusive to the Ivy League. They're available at other top schools as well. So one of the main things that's really unique to an Ivy League basically is the name recognition. But I mean, in closure, I think the prestige really does speak to the quality, more or less, in the sense that just the quality of the students who attend it, just because they're all very like-minded individuals who are very motivated and who contribute to the academic environment and really add value to your education. And one thing also is that the high tuition really speaks to, at least in my experience, the school seems to really care about its students to an extent. So for example, my parents have a really direct comparison of a public school education versus a private Ivy school, because like I mentioned, my brother goes to a public New York university. And my parents are constantly getting emails from Columbia, updating them about what's happening on campus, how I'm doing in school, all this stuff they always inform the parents. And there's a big investment or effort on the school's part to incorporate the whole family in the Columbia experience, more or less. To put it bluntly, your parents won't necessarily be kept in the dark, and you won't be. I'm always getting updates from Columbia, always getting emails. But then at my brother's school, my parents never hear from his school. They never get any updates. There's never really a lot of events going on that they know about, or even my brother, he doesn't get a lot of updates. If something major happens on campus, he'll occasionally get a notification, but they're not as informed. And on my campus, at least at Columbia, there's always events going on, not necessarily academic, but just personal interest events. And you're always notified, you're always encouraged to participate. So that's something I really like about that kind of community. So, I mean, that's basically it about kind of the tangible aspects or tangible benefits. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask, or just in general, or you can ask about my particular experience. I'd be very happy to share. Be honest about Colombia in particular, people have very different experiences, and it kind of depends on your personality. So that's one thing that you should consider if you choose to reach for an Ivy or a competitive school. Each of them is different. They're all prestigious in that sense, but the culture of each school is incredibly different, and the types of students at each school are very different. And because of their majors or the certain things that those schools advertise, they attract different students. For example, Columbia has a pretty strong finance and neuroscience department. We have a lot of finance students, a lot of pre-med students. Same thing with Wharton. Brown is known to have a more relaxed academic culture, and that's also stems from their curriculum. So Brown has an open curriculum, and a lot of grades are pass-fail. So any grade at Brown can be theoretically optional. You can pass-fail any class pretty much, if I understand it correctly. So they're known to be a little more laid back versus Cornell and Columbia are known to be really academically rigorous, almost to a point where it's not good. So that's one of my main concerns when I applied to Columbia and got accepted. When I decided to go there, I started hearing all of this terrible stuff about, oh, Columbia has a terrible stress culture. You know, it's really bad for your mental health. Same thing with Cornell. I heard a lot of similar things. Personally, I haven't had that experience. I thought everyone was very supportive. All of my friends are supportive of me and of each other. No one wants someone else to secretly fail. Of course, that's just my personal experience. My friend who's also at Columbia, I think he had a different experience. He's more introverted, and Columbia is known for being quite difficult to make friends just because Columbia is in the city. So that's one thing that a lot of people don't really tell you, but because Columbia University is in the middle of Manhattan, people find their entertainment not on campus, but outside of campus. So the mentality is, why would you stay on campus when you can go downtown? So that's one of the things that people complain about Columbia often, is that our community isn't as close and people are very independent, and independent both socially and academically. So a lot of people have complained that, you know, people don't really collaborate on school projects and people don't like to share or to help each other. And that's just stuff I've heard. But personally, once again, I've never had that experience. My friend, he's found it a little difficult at Columbia just because you have to be relatively extroverted to an extent to really enjoy it and to make the most of your surroundings. And even though we're in Manhattan, one thing that I can say about Columbia is a lot of people don't get off campus, unfortunately. I've never had that problem, but I know some people who go the entire semester without leaving campus. And I know people who have gone 4 years without exploring New York. And a big part of Columbia is New York City, and I think that the two are inseparable. So if you go to Columbia, you have to really want to take advantage of New York, or else I don't really see the point in choosing that Ivy over another school. Sorry, let me find. What is the best time to start writing essays, and when should I finally send all the documents? So it depends on which deadline you choose. If you choose to apply early decision, I believe that deadline for the Ivy League is November 1st. So you should start writing your essays at least several months ahead of time, because you want to get them proofread by other people. You want to get them edited. There should be absolutely no grammatical mistakes, or you want to make the sentence structure as clear as possible and your overall message. So I would highly suggest starting to write those several months ahead of time. If you're applying regular decision, that's January 1st. Also several months ahead of time. So just remember that kind of as a rule. Try to get started as early as you can. So, I mean, if you want, you can start writing now, you know. The more time you have, the better. In terms of when you should send all of your documents in, it's not rolling admissions, so they wait until they get all of the applications to start evaluating. So if you submit the day of the deadline, it's technically fine. But one thing I would highly recommend is don't submit like an hour before the deadline's due, because conveniently your internet will stop working or the system will be overwhelmed and it will shut down. So I would just, try to hand it in at least like a day or two ahead of time, just in case, because I've known people who submitted it several hours before, and because so many people are submitting it last minute, the system gets overwhelmed and then it won't process your application. And that would be terrible if you put in all this work just to not be able to apply. Hi, why did you choose Columbia? I chose Columbia, this isn't the best reason, but I chose Columbia for New York City because, and now that I've come to Columbia, I realized there's so many more benefits than just New York City. Quite honestly, I was a little upset that I was going to Columbia in the beginning. My top choice, ironically, was Brown, and Brown is the complete opposite of Columbia in terms of academics. Brown is an open curriculum and Columbia has a core curriculum. And I wanted the open curriculum because I didn't know what I wanted to study. So I was honestly a little upset that I was going to Columbia. But after I went there, after the first week, I was like, how could I ever be upset going here? This is the best possible choice I've ever made. Columbia's core curriculum, you have to really love it to go to Columbia, and I've really fallen in love with it since I've arrived. So if you've done some research and you think that the core curriculum is for you, I would highly recommend Columbia, or University of Chicago also has a core curriculum. What school did you study? What do you mean by that exactly? Do you mean which high school did I go to, or if it's which high school? I moved to the US for high school, and because I moved to a really rural town, I went to an incredibly small high school, a small public school. So it's not like I went to a prep school. I didn't go to Exeter or Andover. And that's one of the things I really want to emphasize. Admissions, they take into consideration your context. So I won't be compared directly to someone who finished Deerfield Academy or Exeter. I will be considered and evaluated in the context of my circumstances. So they'll be asking, did this student take the most rigorous courses at her high school? Not how many APs does she have versus how many APs does this other person have who went to a different school. So for you guys, they'll take into consideration your high school in Kazakhstan. They won't compare you to, me, for example, in my high school. What score SAT did you have to attend Columbia? So my score actually wasn't phenomenal. I got a 1510 out of 1600. So I think it was like maybe a 790 math, 720 English. So my English score wasn't that great, but because it's a holistic process, they evaluate other aspects of your application. So they evaluated my, they didn't just evaluate me on my SAT score. And one really big mistake that I made that I would recommend that you guys don't is time yourself well. So I made the mistake of studying abroad before my senior year. And I had one chance to take my SAT in October. So I took my SAT for the first time, October of my senior year. So I only had one chance to get the score that I needed. So it was a lot of pressure. So you guys are, I think, 10th graders maybe? You guys have 1 year. So I would recommend taking your SAT as early as you can. Well, as early as you feel prepared. So you have enough time to retake it several times if you need to. Have you applied to universities as the US resident or an international student? So I know that your acceptance rates vary for international students versus US, and you apply based on where your high school is. So even though I hold citizenship country as well, I applied as a US resident because I went to high school in the US. So that's kind of how they evaluate whether or not you're domestic or not. And this also kind of, this varying acceptance could also help you decide which school you go to. So Columbia, for example, we're the Ivy with the most international students. So we attract a lot of international students, and our acceptance rate for international students is higher than other Ivies. Can you say anything about the grant system in Ivy League schools? What kind of grants are available? So financial aid is need-based. It's not, the Ivy Leagues don't offer academic scholarships, just because if they did, it'd be really hard to qualify people just because everyone's kind of on par academically. They're all very similar. So grants come, it's kind of hard, but it depends on the person, the financial aid package you get. There'll be different types of grants. But in terms of grants after you arrive at Columbia, you can get grants to study abroad. So we have a presidential fellowship at Columbia. So your first year, they'll pay for you to go somewhere for the entire summer. And that's a really great opportunity. There's a lot of fellowships, so you can go on the school website and look into it. And there's a lot of there's a very large diversity in terms of the types of money and funding that you can get for independent research projects and things like that. I want to ask you, what were your 3 best extracurriculars that you filled in the Common App? So I don't know if I could top 3. I think a lot of my major, so I applied as a astrophysics and East Asian studies major, but I didn't have a lot of coursework in physics and astrophysics because I said I went to a really rural high school with not a lot of academic opportunity. So on my application, I kind of played the angle of my language interest and my linguistic inclination. So my essay was about languages, and as were a lot of my extracurriculars. So for my extracurriculars, the main ones that I emphasized were the fact that I spent 3 summers in China studying Chinese, and then I spent time studying French and Spanish. So those were kind of the ones that I really emphasized because they were directly linked to who I identified as. What would you recommend to determine if the university's culture fits your personality? So a lot of it comes down to academics, quite honestly, because depending on the structure of the academics, they invite or attract certain types of students. So like I said, the open curriculum at Brown and the pass-fail grading option, a lot of people I know who got accepted to Brown and who go there said that the campus culture at Brown is a little more relaxed and people are more just kind of laid back, versus Columbia and Cornell are known to be really stress culture, competitive, academically rigorous. And I think that comes from the core curriculum as well as just the feeder schools that they are, because a lot of people go into finance and STEM from Columbia specifically. But also look into the extracurriculars as well as the location. For example, Dartmouth is in rural New Hampshire. So the people who go there are pretty outdoorsy. They're really into hiking and skiing, and Dartmouth has a bigger athletic culture than Columbia. And that makes sense because Columbia is in New York City. So people who go to Columbia are a little more eccentric, a little more urban. So a lot of it has to do with geographic location and academics. So I would just consider those factors, see which suits you best, as well as the majors offered. And also, a lot of it, you can kind of go on online forums. A lot of these forums offer candid, no filter accounts of school life or academic life at some of these schools. The students will be quite honest about their experiences. In which field exactly have you studied? So I'm currently studying mathematics and East Asian studies. So at college, I study math and Chinese. Did you enter Columbia on ED or regular decision? I was a regular decision applicant because I took my SAT so late that it was impossible for me, even if I wanted to be early decision. So I was regular. Can you tell us about your academic achievements that you mentioned when applied to Columbia? So in terms of, like, besides just transcript, I guess a lot of my thing was just language study and things like that. I was a part of a lot of academic clubs, but I mean, I could reach out to you guys personally if you want to email me, and I could kind of go through my application with you guys if you want, but I'm running short on time. So what is special about the core curriculum? The core curriculum is really interesting because it unites all graduates of Columbia, and I think that's what makes our alumni network pretty intimate. For example, I was at a football game at Columbia, and I met someone who was 80 years old, and they had taken the exact same classes as me. So it connects people. Every single person who graduated Columbia has a shared experience, which is pretty unique. Did you take the SAT subject test? So Columbia doesn't require them, And I think the only Ivy that requires them is Cornell maybe. So I applied to Cornell, so that's the only reason I took them. I needed 2 SAT subject tests to apply to Cornell. But otherwise, if I wasn't applying to Cornell, I wouldn't have taken them. What role do scholarships play in the application process? So financial aid is a completely different application. So all this financial stuff isn't relevant to your academic application. Does it make sense that I live in Central Asia in my essay comparing with other international students and American students? What I mean is that USA has more opportunities in academics rather than Kazakhstan. Yes, they take into consideration your context and your life. So for example, I had very few academic opportunities at my school because I'm from a really rural area, but compared to someone who went to school in New York City, for example. But they know that, and they look at me just in the context of your high school. So that's why it's very important to take the most rigorous classes that your school offers. Challenge yourself at your school, and they'll appreciate that. Okay, is that all for questions? So I know we're running short on time. So I'll put my email, and if you guys have any additional questions or want to just ask me about my experience, feel free to reach out to me. Is it possible to enter an Ivy League university with high SAT score without any great extracurricular activities? So, I mean, anything's possible, but once again, it's a holistic process. So a high SAT score doesn't guarantee you admission, but neither does great extracurriculars. It's kind of a lottery. So just convey yourself as the best you can on your application and kind of see where it goes from there. It's all a lottery because I know some really qualified people who didn't get in, unfortunately. So you said that STEM schools are same in Ivy, and is it the same way in computer science then? I mean, it's similar. One of the things that I can say about Columbia is, one thing about Ivies is that a lot of them have graduate schools, so you're competing with graduate students for spots in classes. So I know a lot of my friends are CS, and they have a lot of trouble getting into classes, which is a pretty common complaint at Columbia, for example.